Welcome to the Pen Testing and Cyber Essentials discussion. For this, we're going to do more of a workshop, so we're kind of opening up to discussion-based kind of forum. We do have some content that we can go through to kind of give you some guidance, but what we were hoping to do was kind of give you the opportunity to spend an hour with us asking any questions you may have about Cyber Essentials, penetration testing, the services that we provide, what we do, methodologies, absolutely anything that you consider kind of as a product that you obviously resell. So generally because you obviously already have this kind of product that you know about, we didn't see much point in kind of reiterating what you already know. So we were kind of hoping to just kind of open it up for an hour, give you full opportunities to ask any questions that you may have. So by show of hands or just shout out, whatever's easier. I believe there are some microphones around, which Emma and Tracy have. So if you do just want to start throwing up hands. Richard's the Cyber Essentials guy. He'll know everything about Cyber Essentials, and I'm much more pen testing. So up to you guys. Excellent start. I'm really impressed. Really happy that went really well, actually. So I'm just going to go straight now. I think it might be easier to just leave. One question? Yeah. Excellent.
Oh, yeah. So I've probably worked with both of you doing the Cyber Essentials. I think I've seen your name pop up a few times on the Cyber Essentials applications. What I was going to ask, what sort of qualifications do you look towards when you're looking for pen testing candidates and stuff like that?
So with regards to just pen testing candidates, it's all about sort of your skill level. With the Cyber Essentials schemes, as we are CREST certified, the minimum our assessors have to have is what's called CPSA. So it's essentially a 2-hour multiple choice exam. And then from there, as long as you go through our process and you're able to follow the test specification and everything, you can go on site and do all the testing, assessing that. But I believe you came to IT governance, not with...
Yeah, I joined without any qualification, but just a background in pen testing and an ethical hacking degree.
Yes, that's sort of my background. I come from the military, moved into IT and cybersecurity and that sort of stuff. So I didn't really come from a university background or qualification background, anything like that. Sort of working my way through. So obviously a lot of people I speak to obviously say about Network Plus, Security Plus. So I just wondered if there's any other accreditations that you could recommend.
A lot of people seem to go for OSCP. That seems to be a very personal kind of driven qualification. It is quite rare to see some companies kind of offering the training for that. It's much more kind of, you do it out of hours, it's a lot of lab work, it's a lot of like your own personal time, so companies are less kind of, they're a bit more reluctant to kind of give you that time to practice for OSCP because it's so many lab work. CPSA, CRT, that kind of route, the CREST routes, even the Tiger schemes, which are sometimes the equivalents as well. Those are probably the accreditations you probably prefer to take the route of. Once you've kind of got the CREST stuff, you kind of look for your check status. So once you've got CRT, you're a check team member, you go for government clearance, that kind of stuff, and that's the kind of progression that we take. So I've done my CRT, and I've got enough security clearance to kind of be a check team member, and then I'll look to progress to CCT, which is just more advanced testing, and then with the right security clearance, go into a team leader.
Perfect, thank you. And just in terms of your Cyber Essential services and your pen testing services, are you going to be looking to expand that field, or is it you just going to stick with pen testing, or are you going to move up to sort of spear phishing campaigns, USB drops, that sort of stuff?
So we already kind of do, it might actually be better if I just bring up the services slide, and then that would obviously make a lot more sense for you guys. So it does look a bit sporadic, I do apologise. I can't explain any of these, I do have lots of content about each one. So those are the kind of services that we offer. With regards to spear phishing and phishing, Rich has done plenty of those kind of attacks. As for the USB drops, they kind of fall under our more Cyber Essentials and red teaming attacks. We do them, and especially with Cyber Essentials, we do look at more kind of exploiting the person more than the actual web application or server. It's very much similar to what Alan touched on this morning. So we do USB drops. It's based on what the client kind of wants for that physical pen test. We've had, or I've definitely heard of some tests where one of our consultants walked into one building, walked into their IT department, picked up one of the servers, walked out, and then came back and said, I've got a server for you, and they're like, that's not ours. So there are definitely different ways that we do these sometimes of attacks. It happens. We've got plenty of war stories to talk about with pen testing, but so yeah, we definitely do kind of goes down those attacks. I mean, Rich would probably be able to kind of talk about phishing a bit better.
Yeah, with the phishing campaigns, it is a very sort of tailored thing. So we'll work with you to come up with a scenario that you think will essentially get your users what could be believable, what would a real attacker be able to find out about your company. Do you have a company portal that the attacker's going to say, oh, we've moved the company portals to this address, please log in. User will click on the link and give us the credentials. It is, as it's been said quite a bit today, it is the end users that are going to be the weakest form, and it is all about sort of the training, which is a service that is offered along with the phishing. But it's a lot of people are very surprised to how many people click on a link, how many people download external content. So it is definitely an interesting part of the job, and pen testing in general, just the social engineering aspect of it.
Yeah, especially with the phishing, I think, I don't know if it was you or Hilmi, but one of our consultants had a phishing campaign, and their point of contact accidentally was it you?
Yeah, so a war story, we were doing a phishing campaign. We send you test emails to make sure it comes through. We sent it to the one client. The next week we performed the actual attack. I got an email, oops, I fell for it.
So yeah, these things do happen and they do slip through. But we do sometimes, you see quite a lot of people doing almost like a stage process. So we make up maybe 3 different levels of convincing emails. One is obviously very obvious. It's the wrong image, the wrong URL, the wrong kind of language, all that kind of stuff. And you see kind of how perceptive your staff really are. And then from there, you might then take another one of, okay, well, actually, you've got a package downstairs, you're able to come collect it. And then from there, we look at maybe being the IT team, being like, you need to do a password reset. So we do different levels, and you kind of get an idea of whether people are either learning from their previous mistakes or they're starting to progress with their own training. And then we just go back and say, you just need more training on this aspect. This is what you kind of look for. So.
Perfect, thank you.
How do you do a simulated phishing? How do you actually do a simulated attack?
So, like I said before, we'll work with you to essentially come up with a scenario, who it's going to come from. So, for example, I was testing a company called Richard's IT. We'd if we were doing it a realistic thing rather than just a tick box exercise, we'd purchase a domain like Richard's IT, so Richard IT. So that's one thing that the users should be aware of to look out for with phishing attempts. Then we'd simply log onto our mail server, upload the template, the scenario that we've agreed with you, and send it out at a date and time that sort of suits you where it is going to be most perceptible to users. So a Friday afternoon we're going to get more clicks than a Monday afternoon because everyone's ready to go home. Everyone's just going to click on the email at that point. And that's essentially it, to be honest with you. It's all about getting the scenario right and the template right. That's what is going to convince the users, essentially.
And that's sent through the normal sort of mail system, so it would just be sent to that person's mail.
Yeah, so we have a platform used for phishing specifically. So it's kind of, we upload the HTML content, builds up the nice template, and then with the user list, it's kind of just like a mail to. So it's almost as if coming from an Outlook server, it just goes straight through to them. Obviously, we ask that the client doesn't kind of blacklist the server that we're coming from, and obviously makes them aware that obviously they're coming through. So they kind of do alter their, maybe like, for example, if you've got mail protection or spam filtering, then we do kind of ask that. But essentially, the mail just comes through like a normal email would from either another colleague or from a promotion. So it just comes through as a standard email from another server.
Thanks.
On that question, what does IT governance provide once you've done that? Would they get a report? How do you drill down the information of once you've done the attack?
So when you provide us with the list of users, we do typically ask if you're happy to provide us with like what department in, such as HR or finance or marketing, and obviously with that we can see who is what's the most susceptible department within it. That all gets essentially written up into a report where we'll break it down by department if you choose to give us that information, or if we just do it as a company as a whole. From there, it's up to you what you want to do, but there is the option to take online training for those departments, and you can obviously give it to the more susceptible departments. So, for example, if HR was to fall for the attack, more users fell for the attack, then they can obviously get access to the training first, and you know who specifically needs it.
So you see who's clicked on what link and how far they've gone through the process?
So there's three things that we essentially measure. The first one is, have they fallen for it? So we're able to monitor the mailbox. It is quite often when we get a response saying, oh, the link doesn't lead anywhere, or one particular one I had was, why is your domain wrong where it's coming from? So that's the first thing. So we can respond to that and say, oh, try this link, and respond to them that way from the mailbox. The next one is we have an embedded tracking image within it. So when you get the little one at the top saying external content can't be downloaded, we can check if users have downloaded the image essentially. And then the last one is the link. Are they going to click on that link and go to evildomain.com? More often than not, that is what they do. And then that's essentially it, because once they've clicked on the link, that could be it. A piece of malware could be downloaded from there, or if they click on the link, that's enough for us to say if that is a logon box, they're going to put in their credentials from that point. So.
Just touching on the subject of credentials, when you do your spear phishing attacks, obviously you monitor who clicks on what else and that sort of stuff, monitor what countries they're in, those sort of specifics. Do you have it report back that they've entered their credentials?
So we tend not to harvest credentials just because it is a very sensitive piece of information. We'd rather not store that, and with the reports we don't name people who have entered credentials. We can provide that as a separate thing off the report, because the reports are intended to be given around, and if we provide you a report and says CEO has clicked on the link and given his password, he's not going to want to see that report.
You talked about like user education. So if you've undertaken the spear phishing attack, what would you then recommend as the next step to educate the users? And do you have any sort of stats around the effectiveness of that training? So, i.e., do you then do a repeat test and see a much better percentage in terms of who's actually clicked and who hasn't?
Yes, so typically what is done is we sell the phishing attack, we give the report, give you all the information, and then the training is undertaken after then whenever they choose to do it. Typically what does happen is there are repeat tests to see what to see if the percentage just goes down. I don't necessarily have the figures on, but over time it does get better. But it completely depends, like I say, on the scenario. Like some users do become more susceptible to and aware of the emails that they're receiving. So sometimes we change up the scenario, completely change up who it's coming from, and see if they fall for it. There's no definitive figure on do people get better. It's are they aware of every type of scenario, which typically is no. But it's all about taking it that one step at a time to make sure they do become more aware, and we close off that entry point into a network essentially.
We're going to have Emma walking around all day.
Cool. Well, it was. Well, say, for instance, so you do a vulnerability test or a penetration test as part of Cyber Essentials. What are the kind of like top 5 kind of common vulnerabilities that you see, and the kind of typical, oh, Bob's done this again, and kind of what would you say is the common
With
vulnerabilities?
regards to Cyber Essentials, the most common sort of failing issues we find are patching essentially. Within the standard, there is essentially a 30-day cool-off period from once a patch is released before it becomes a failing point within the standard. it is hard for a lot of companies to meet that, and there is an element of leeway given at the assessor's discretion to determine that the patch cycle is does work and isn't going to leave massive holes in the system. From personal experience, the worst one is Java. The amount of companies that require old legacy versions of Java and essentially just leave these massive holes is more common than not. 9 times out of 10, they say they need it, but they don't actually need these sort of things available to everyone, or they don't have the right compensating controls in place to reduce the attack surface of that one issue. So patching is the biggest issue we find.
With regards to penetration testing, it depends on which kind of service you're looking at. So with web application, a lot of the common issues are server issues. So you frequently see SSL come up, you frequently see verbose headers where the server underneath the application isn't being hardened appropriately. They're not either using a gold build or at least following at least industry standards. So those are the very common issues that we always find, all the low-hanging fruit. What a lot of companies, we've realised, actually don't follow the right kind of access controls as well. That one seems to be quite a bit of a problem. Whenever we're doing quite advanced applications, if we have obviously different user levels and user roles, notice that, for example, a low-privileged user can kind of do the administrative stuff just by accident. So a lot of people are very inquisitive when they use web applications just naturally. We found that just by clicking around, we're actually able to get to stuff that maybe we shouldn't. I had one application which I think monitored truck speeds, and I only had a low privilege user, and all of the options were grayed out. I realised that if I just went to the URL of /users, I had full admin access to do whatever I wanted, which was horrific. I think they actually destroyed that app afterwards. I think it was just a disaster. I think it was riddled. So they just kind of killed it in the end. But that kind of access control of just relying on client-side controls. So when we do all of these access controls, we look at whether it's managed by JavaScript or whether it's actually circumvented server-side actually in the database. So a lot of problems is a lot of people will rely on JavaScript and say, well, actually, if you've got this user role equal to 1, you can't see this list. But with Java, you can obviously bypass it via the browser, proxies, that kind of stuff, and you can actually end up bypassing a lot of those controls just by going around the code base, which a lot of people don't realize that kind of access controls is definitely a two-step process. It's, first of all, stop them at a client side to kind of get rid of the standard people that are just inquisitive by naturally clicking, and then check it server side as well to make sure the user role that they've been provided isn't obviously being frivolous and kind of allowing other stuff. With infrastructure, externally, again, it's more the SSL configuration, server configurations. It's people not using the right hardening guides, not looking at, for example, benchmarking. And internals, it goes probably back to patching. You find a lot of servers that kind of just, again, if they're on the wrong cycle, or they've not appropriately implemented the right policies, or kind of like anything in between, then patching seems to be quite a big problem as well.
Another issue that we find a lot is people having privileges that they don't need to have. There's a lot of companies that are going to, this group needs admin access. 9 times out of 10 they don't. It's more that they want it. I was out in Algeria a month ago, and their head of IT had domain access to everything. If his account gets compromised, the attacker's essentially got the company. So it's all about working to the principle of least privilege for the majority of users, giving them access to only what they need access for their job function.
A lot of these things kind of arise when someone says, oh, I just need to get this done. And that kind of mentality and that kind of the way that people do things does open up, well, I just need to get this done, I'll just open it for now. And they might either forget something or they might leave something open on a firewall, and there's no real official change process. I know it does take time, especially if you've got a nice, very strenuous process. Previous companies I've worked for, it would take up to 3 days to get a firewall change. But the whole point of pre-planning and bringing security into that kind of process is so that these things are kind of addressed early on. It is just simple human error to be like, okay, well, I need this done now. And it's normally higher up and they kind of don't have real consideration from the bottom up. or a security aspect of like, well, this needs to be done. So especially with web developers, for example, we've had multiple clients that will develop a web application, but what they've told is, well, I need this web application to do this, but no one's told them, well, I need it to do this, but safely and securely. And that's where you kind of start coming across problems, because developers don't have that security background. They don't need to know about security. They've been given a task and a job, and that's how they do it. And then when we come in and we say, well, yes, your code's great, the application looks fantastic, and from a functionality point of view, it works fine. But from a security point of view, your code base is not styled the right way. So we do come across those issues where someone has literally just said, I need this, get it done. And that's where you start to see a few security flaws, more in the human error of process than anything else. Oh, got
Hi. Can you describe, as part of the CE process, the difference between a vulnerability test and a penetration test, and what actually gets done when I order like CE DIY? I know I give all the IP addresses out to you guys, and you do a scan, don't you, when I schedule it? Could you just describe what actually happens when you do that and how thorough that is?
Yeah, so as you said, so you fill in the scope, you give us the IP address, you've had the questionnaire all filled in. The whole purpose of the external testing is for us to verify your answers within the questionnaire, essentially. So that's for the internal, like if you did C+ or Cyber Essentials, all the testing we do is to verify what you've said. With the external vulnerability scan, it's essentially, we run a vulnerability scanner called Nessus that just performs sort of basic checks. There is actually a slide that goes into, that's essentially what it does. So you can see that it does essentially a port scan of the IP addresses, the full 65,000 TCP range, and then the top 1,024 UDP, just because that would take too long if we were to do everything. And then once it's discovered the open ports, it'll essentially do a version or service detection on it and see what is there to determine what the next checks that it'll do. But it'll do the next lot of checks at a basic unauthenticated level. So, for example, if it finds SSH, it'll try to use a password, username and password list to try and brute force into there. It'll detect the version of it and say, is this a vulnerable version of an OpenSSH you have installed on this service? It is simply just a vulnerability assessment and not a full penetration test. There won't be any attempt to exploit anything or take anything down. Everything that is done is essentially a proof of concept. It's, you have this version installed, chances are it will be vulnerable, and that's how it detects it. Because it's done from an authenticated point of view, and the whole point of Cyber Essentials is to stop the most prevalent threats that essentially what is known as a script kiddie could attempt to exploit. It's not sort of a magic bullet to stop everything. That's...
The government like to say that CE is aimed at preventing about 80% of typical internet threats.
Yes.
Do you think that's right?
I wouldn't say it's wrong.
Yeah, no one's going to argue with the government, are they? Yeah, exactly. Nessus definitely does have its perks. It definitely picks up all the low-hanging fruit, common stuff that, like Reggie said, script keys that are going to go out and they're going to find it and they're going to scan. I mean, if you throw a big scanner at something and it picks up all the common issues and you find them and you obviously you mitigate yourselves against those kind of vulnerabilities, you are protecting yourself against a lot of the issues. What Nessus does is it has different modules that are continuously updated. If new vulnerabilities comes out, someone would most likely create a script or a check or a verification, and that's all it's doing is running checks, verifications, checking, okay, well, based on the database I have, anything less than this version is vulnerable, and this is what it's vulnerable to. So Nessus does definitely have its perks, and to be honest, Nessus would pick up most of the issues that you find in a vulnerability assessment. 80% might be a bit of an exaggeration, depending on what kind of test you're doing. Infrastructure, definitely. Web application, I would probably disagree slightly, only because code is completely different and Nessus doesn't do the intuitive checking code workflows and bypasses. It's not dynamic in that sense, but certainly for infrastructure, it definitely picks up most things. What we do is penetration testing, so just extending from that. The difference with the penetration test on top of the vulnerability scan is we will run Nessus. We don't rely on it for penetration testing. We do a lot more manual stuff. So we check, obviously, all the network discovery for infrastructure. We look at open port, seeing whether we can get any banner versions. Then we research ourselves what that's vulnerable to. Try and go any further that we can. If we're able to find a vulnerable version, can we get into it via a bypass? Then what can we get to from there? So we do take those extra steps that Nessus won't necessarily do as an intuitive kind of scanner. With web application scanning, Nessus is good. It covers your basic checks, your HTTP headers, your whether you can do anything malicious, for example, put data up or delete data, which are common HTTP methods that are considered weak. But it won't do, like I said, the whole code-based analysis. It won't look at source code, it won't look at scripts, and it won't look at version numbers. And the idea of the penetration test, it does do the whole, you have a consultant reading code, understanding the code, and basically analysing what the web app should do, and then trying to get it to do something completely different and that it shouldn't. So, for example, Nessus won't pick up a authorization bypass or an authentication bypass, for example, generally because what a tester would do is they'll try to log in, get all the data, and then they'll remove all their session stuff, which Nessus won't necessarily know to do, and see if you can get the data again. I had an application that Nessus didn't pick up, I don't think, anything apart from SSL, but it was a application where the parent would install an app onto your mobile, and the parent could then log into the portal and just monitor your own kids' phones. What we were able to do was we were able to get all of the data from that web application without actually having to log in, which Nessus wouldn't have picked up. So we're able to get child's names, date of birth, email addresses, profile photos, and basically download all of that stuff without actually having to log in anywhere. Nessus only flagged SSL, but that kind of intuitive penetration test does go into that depth of trying to get the data in a method that's completely unusual, trying to use the app against itself. When I told the client, they took the app down very quickly. So it was a test environment, so it's not actually live or anything, so no need to worry. But again, the differences between vulnerability assessment and penetration tests are completely different. You have the intuition experience in a penetration test of looking at code and kind of going a bit deeper and a bit further. Hope that helps.
In terms of your, so obviously something you just touched on then, you use one application, Nessus. What about, do you not use any other applications to confirm them? Because obviously Nessus won't pick everything up, like you said.
No.
But something like Rapid7, I suppose, that could pick up something completely different from Nessus. So is there anything you do to verify your findings?
So there are definitely other tools that it's kind of like a little Venn diagram. So Nessus will pick up, say, 80%. Nextpost might pick up something else. OpenVals and Qualys might pick up something else, and essentially you end up building a nice big picture. And you probably cover 95% if you bought every single scanner, but at the end of the day, that's going to cost you an arm and a leg. What we do is we use Nessus as a good baseline standard. It covers all of our low-hanging fruit, and then we use the manual verification on top. So we either customize our own tools, we do verification checks, for example. Well, actually, to be honest, even with Nessus, we do verification. It might say that it's got one response, and we'll just double check it as well, just to kind of confirm. But we use different tools, different methodologies, anything that's built in with, so we use Kali Linux as a pen testing platform. So we'll use that mainly for, there's loads of tools in there. We also look at GitLab as well. A lot of people have customized their own tools. We've created our own SSL tool, for example, that kind of, instead of just reporting it, it does loads of different checks and writes kind of all the content out, and we can review our code a lot better. So we do kind of don't just rely on single-handed tools because, again, like you said, there's other tools might pick up other things. There's a web application test scanner called Arachne, which is open source. And I used that previously, and it's claimed that some things are there based on certain responses, and it's not. For web application testing, we use Burp Suite Pro, which is a great internet proxy. And what it might see is SQL injection, but what it's looking for is time-based, and that could just be because the application is slowed down and it's not actually there. So we always verify every single issue, even if it's reported by Nessus, we always verify it as well. We can't solely rely on just scanners. It's not that we don't trust them. They're great for kind of coverage, and we make sure that we use them. But as far as actual testing goes, we like to verify our issues. Otherwise, we report false positives, and then you log in and be like, ah, that's wrong. And then we look very silly.
Dealt with a few false positives. The Vista system was the best one.
Yes.
Vista comes up a lot.
So with Cyber Essentials, Nessus is the industry-approved scanner to use for Cyber Essentials, and it uses the bespoke Cyber Essentials policy that's given to us by Crest. It does pick up a lot of false positives. As the best way to put it is, scanners are essentially stupid. Like, it does require the manual verification on top of that. So the way Nessus will detect something as Windows Vista is it'll take time to live values from responses, it'll take banner headers, and it'll essentially just make a guess. And the way the scanners essentially work is it'll report worst case scenario. So even though you're running Windows Server 2012, it'll report it as Vista because it does have the potential to be Vista based on the information it has gathered. And then from there, with regards to Cyber Essentials, it is the false positive evidence that proves it isn't, essentially. We'd love to take your word for it, but there's been many times when there has actually been Vista running there when it shouldn't have been running. So,
guys, just appreciate a comment. We've got vulnerability testing, and you've got your Hacker Guardian service model. Primarily, you're using the same underlying kit to do the work. It's just a branding. You're just presenting it as a different branded product.
So
service.
are you talking about the difference in vulnerability testing and penetration testing?
I'm talking about vulnerability testing per se. Hacker
Yeah.
Guardian to me is an interesting service model, given you're looking to enter into a contractual term with the client. You're using the same tools underneath the covers to do this the same thing as you would with Cyber Essentials?
Um,
I think the simple answer to that is Hacker Guardian is a product which we resell from Komodo. It's not one which we've designed or run ourselves, which is why Callum's going...
yeah, I've not actually come across Hacker Guardian. I'm unfortunately just a pen tester. So.
Okay, yeah, no problem. In that case then, as far as Komodo is, you're allocating that specific to the PCI space, or it is a product that could be utilized within a broader, richer Cyber Essentials experience?
It can be used in a very much broader environment. Simply running a standardized scan, you can put it on virtually any website, and you can set it so that it will run on a regular basis and provide an update saying that it's been scanned. So you can simply have it as part of a website demonstrating that it's being scanned for viruses. You can just put Hacker Guardian on it as an example of what you can do.
Fantastic, thanks.
Thank you.
Apologies, I could ask you questions all day.
No, that's all right.
So on the screen, obviously, it says about weak credentials. Now, this is something that I think has been recently changed in the Cyber Essentials in the Cyber Essentials scheme. Sorry. Obviously, as part of the Cyber Essentials, I think originally you had to set it to your passwords to change every 90 days, that sort of thing. They've scrapped that now, haven't they? Because
a lot of people obviously recommend now not to change your passwords, because when you set your passwords to change regularly, people use patterns and you get a lot of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5s or 5 exclamation marks towards the end, that sort of stuff. What do you recommend we advise to our users about their passwords? Should they change their passwords regularly? Should they use a password manager?
So, within the scheme, there's nothing specifically says you have to do anything. There are questions within the questionnaire that say, how often do users change his password, or something? Is there a lockout policy? In my personal experience and the way I operate is password managers are great with things to implement. You've just got your one master password. As long as that's secure, then hopefully the password manager is going to be secure as well, and you can implement different random passwords throughout the whole thing. A big thing that's come in within sort of the last year or two is the use of passphrases instead of a mixture of number and letters that you're never going to remember. One that prevents users from writing it down because it's something they can remember instantly, and it's got length to it if they use the right passphrase. So, for example, I'm not going to tell you what my password is, but it's 32 characters long. And I can just remember that off the top of my head because it's something I remember. It's got the alphanumeric and special characters in it, so it's going to make it really hard to figure it out. But then the passphrase itself, no one, I can say pretty certainly that someone's not going to be able to guess what it is because of the amount of phrases that it could be, the amount of words it could have included in it. So
it's the same with penetration testing. OWASP is normally what we follow for a good standard guide on password policies. However, like Rich said, it keeps changing frequently. We keep up to date with it to make sure. I mean, before, I remember a few years ago, it was 8 characters, and it was make sure you're using random letters all over the place. But like you said, people are going to start following patterns of 1, 2, 3, or then change it again to 1, 2, 3, 4, and that kind of stuff. I have noticed that they've now started to definitely support more of the sentence-based passphrases. So, for example, even adding a space does make it more complicated. A lot of brute forcing tools at the moment don't actually accommodate for that kind of alteration. So if you've got, for example, this is a password, and it was just that and capitalized, if you did camel case, for example, and had spaces in, that actually, if you put it into a password guessing kind of tool, the entropy of that is actually still quite complicated and would take a long time to crack, even though the simple words are, this is a password with spaces in between. You add a 1, 2, or even exclamation mark at the end, it just keeps expanding. So we do kind of prefer to use passphrases, especially longer ones. What we do find is that sometimes there are actually limitations on passwords. So one of the popular banks actually doesn't allow you to set a very complex password. It limits you on, I think, doesn't allow you to use special characters, which for a banking is quite obscure. But if you're using nice, long, complicated passwords using string sentences, the actual chance of guessing those string sentences that are a nice length is actually still quite difficult. So with regards, we actually follow the OWASP top 10 for password policies. So whenever they update, we change. We normally recommend, obviously more complicated the better, but like you said, you get the whole repetition. So there are actually controls you can implement, especially in web apps where you don't allow subsequent numbers. So you can't have A, B, C, 1, 2, 3. You can't use common passwords in password lists. If we say try and implement a blacklist, so you can't have password 1 and customize your list, don't make it the same as your company name. For example, I've gone on site and I've gone to a client, say IT governance, sorry. And you go on site and you get someone's password and their password is IT governance. And it's just that kind of training people to kind of be a bit more sensible with it. So we do recommend using extra controls like blacklisting for common passwords as well. Try and remove obviously what's available on the internet. Password lists such as RockU, which is obviously a good million passwords. If you're blacklisting anything in there, you've got that extra level of security that someone who stumbles across your application and just says, I'll just run RockU against it, you're kind of got a little bit of certainty that actually none of your users are using such a weak password that's come up in a list.
the other important thing is make sure when you get a new piece of hardware, whether it's a laptop or server, you change the default creds on it. That's something that does come up fairly often. It's well known that software uses these default creds. It's all out there on the internet. So
yeah, we've done a few application tests where if you go to, for example, /admin, and by natural kind of to help people out, it redirects you to the CMS admin page. If you Google that and then just Google default credentials after the name of it, you'll find the default config. A lot of the CMS editors now are kind of, when you install it, you have to set an admin password, but some of the older ones, especially hardware as well, if you're implementing certain firewall types, then you do come across default passwords across the internet. We do try them. It makes sense to try them. And I have got into an admin's CMS by using a default credentials. Those kind of things are quite terrifying, especially when they're available on the internet. So, yeah.
It's interesting you say that, actually. I was speaking to one of our clients and I did some tests, and I actually found vulnerabilities through their Kali Linux box because they hadn't changed the password from Tor. They just left it as that, so I effectively compromised their system by using their own compromising system.
Excellent.
Yeah, so default passwords are a great one.
Yeah, and they do come up a lot, especially on internals. You'll find that the majority of printers come up with the default creds or don't even have any passwords whatsoever. Now, normally you wouldn't expect a printer to be a problem, But if, for example, when we do internal infrastructure, if you have guest wireless and someone can connect to it easily, there's not either the password's on the wall or it's just a sign up page and you just enter your email address. What you could do is sometimes if the segmentation's not been appropriate, from that guest Wi-Fi, you'd be like, okay, well, yes, I can print something, but also the corporate network can also print something. So you're saying there have been scenarios where we've gone from guest into the kind of more media kind of VLAN, accessed the printer, gone through the printer using default creds, worked out the internal network topology, and gone through that way and got into the corporate that side. So when you talk to your third parties, there's a lot of aspects where clients will just say, well, I need a penetration test, but they might not know why or what exactly it is that they need. I've spoken to many clients that you kind of talk to them about it, and as they get to understand the security about their data and the risk of their data, like Alan mentioned earlier, they kind of realise that actually I don't just need an internal network test, I need to check my wireless configuration because that has a route in, for example. Or if you're solely relying on your firewall rules, what if your firewall was to go down? Have you considered your web application? What if your web application protection went down? Have you considered your server configuration? So there are definitely different steps. I mean, Alan explained it perfectly this morning about defense in depth. So we look at every aspect, and that's what we try to do with our clients and kind of understand kind of what they need. So it's great for you guys to kind of, when you talk to your clients, if you can get an understanding of why they're doing it necessarily, because more often than not, you'll get someone that comes to you and says, well, I need a penetration test, and that's it. That's all they've been told. So it's great if you can talk to your clients and you can understand the products and services that you're able to then provide them and make sure they are more secure, not just their web app, but in their entire data. That's kind of what you're looking at. We kind of look at the risk of things, not just the sole problem. I've had tests where web application A, for example, was out of scope, and it was tested frequently, no problems with it. It's payment page, hardened down to the nines, no issues. However, we were able to compromise web app B, and that had influence on web app A. So we were able to get cross-site scripting in one and force that through to the second one, and then that became vulnerable. But testing that one application, it would have been secure. So there are certain connections, and understanding how everything is connected within their environment and their risk and their data is obviously very valuable.
So you've done a penetration test, a vulnerability scan, you've got a clean bill of health. So you've done your test and you've got a clean bill of health. How frequently would you suggest that those tests are performed again, given that you get updates to various outlets and things like that? I
mentioned this morning. We actually chatted about this at lunch as well. But it's entirely dependent on, personally, the data. For example, a brochureware site which has no data in it, is just informational, we would recommend, if it doesn't change and there's no state changing, nothing to do with the infrastructure, nothing to do with the firewalls, every year is a good consistency to kind of be regular. If, however, you are producing new code bases, then we recommend that on every code change, there's a significant change, any firewall change, that it gets pen tested. You might have tested it last month or even last week, and the developers were like, oh, I've got this new version. You're worth pen testing because, like I said, developers are only there to kind of just implement what they've been told. They might not have done it securely. Every 6 months is generally a good rule of thumb for anything retaining data. Banking apps, that kind of stuff, much shorter. You want to make sure that the data is being secured. Obviously, we try to keep up to date as frequently as possible with any new vulnerabilities. So it all depends on the risk of the data. That's why we kind of like those conversations of, well, what are you trying to protect and what are your reasons for protecting it? So the frequency is dependent on what you're looking after. I know it's a bit ambiguous, but it's a general rule.
It's, with regards to Cyber Essential, it's like what Alan mentioned earlier. The certificate's essentially only valid for that day. I get asked all the time, when does our certificate expire? Technically tomorrow. You were secure today, tomorrow something might not be. So the baseline recommendation is with Cyber Essentials to retake it annually or after a large infrastructure change.
It's also good to note that if you are kind of looking after your data as well, to note stuff like new vulnerabilities that come out, be up to date as well. It's a great practice to kind of have, even if you just have a registered kind of email coming in every week or something of anything that's new. So, for example, Eternal Blue, absolute disaster. When that came out, so many people were compromised without realising. So we do recommend that obviously keeping up to date with those are essential. So if you are worried about obviously issues that come out or new vulnerabilities, then it is worth getting checked and getting tested just to for peace of mind as well.
Yeah, no, what it was. Have you got any recommendations on sort of like a point to site kind of VPN solution? Because obviously you could get PPTP, which we know is the devil, but what would you recommend?
For VPN solutions? Not as a product reseller, but I've seen quite a few different implementations of VPN solutions. I think it entirely comes down to the environment that you're running. I've seen Cisco's done very well, and any VPN solution is obviously a bonus, but ones that integrate two-factor authentication is where you're kind of looking for. So we've got, I know other consultancies that would only have a username and password function. What they then did was then implement a two-factor authentication, which integrated with an app, so that you had to use your thumbprint on your work phone, which then allowed you to authenticate, and then you had to enter your username and password. So as far as VPN solutions go, I think it's almost the same as AV. It alternates. I mean, keep up to date with the industry. There's nothing really I can kind of say, this is the ultimate solution. But controls around your VPN are where you're kind of looking for key like security fixes as well. Making sure you're implementing them properly, making sure each server side, your client and your server are both secure, especially the external VPN connection. Make sure everything's hardened, there's no vulnerabilities that side as well. But then also implementing two-step processes. Anything with a VPN should ideally use two-factor authentication. There's no reason not to. It's quite easy to implement. You can either use RSA keys, mobiles, everything now seems to integrate with an app. So as far as the best solution, it's kind of what appropriates to your financial situation, the way that you're kind of implementing it as well. But there's definitely things to be considering when you do want a VPN solution. Two-factor, make sure the servers are hardened again. Sorry, we can't be more direct, but...
You mentioned just a minute ago about you mentioned a minute ago about staying up to date with the latest vulnerabilities and stuff like that. Are there any websites or mailing lists that you recommend, like CND Radar, that sort of thing?
We personally look at, I look at the Register, Hacker News. Those are my two kind of go-tos. Virus Total also does quite a nice one for customers as well. They do actually have kind of like an admin, not an admin, like a program that if you sign up to and register, anyone that updates some or uploads something to Virus Total that is vulnerable, a malicious PDF or anything that's new and it gets recognized, everyone gets an email. It says, watch out for this, update your signatures, that kind of stuff for AV solutions. As far as new vulnerabilities come out, I follow Register, Hacker News, kind of those kind of things of which more affect businesses. I'm sure there are plenty out there that are different, but those are the two that I kind of follow most.
The thing about pen testers and hackers, we all like credit for what we do. So if someone finds something, it'll be on the internet within hours of them finding it.
Yeah, true.
Is there anything else?
We're just going to keep asking you questions here.
Yeah.
Is there any particular reason why you only scan the first 1,024 UDP ports and not all of them?
It would take weeks for us to scan all 65,000 of them.
So the problem with UDP is that it's not, it's a connectionless kind of protocol. So waiting for the results to come back or just kind of understand their issues, there's so many false positives. With UDP, we scan the top 1,000 generally because we want to make sure that the most common ports are secure. If you have some really weird, wacky UDP ports open on a firewall, then it's kind of your own configuration. But the top 1,000 are normally best. They cover, obviously, SNMP and all your kind of other common ports that we check for. It's more, problem with penetration testing compared to hacking is we are limited by time. A hacker has endless amounts of time. They could sit there for days and days and days leaving stuff running. Whereas for us in a security kind of professional manner, we need to get as much coverage as we can in a dedicated amount of time. Otherwise, we would be billing you for millions for sitting and watching your network for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks. So they are pointed. Yeah, I'm sure Alan doesn't mind drawing up a contract, but as far as kind of from a security professional kind of view, we like to do our testing in a nice controlled manner. That's why we ask for permissions and that kind of stuff. Whereas a hacker who has endless amounts of time would probably be able to do that. What you're looking for is endpoints time test of how vulnerable am I if I was to be compromised tomorrow. And that's why we ask, for example, the frequency of pen testing and why you get it done so frequently, because it is at that point.
When you carry out your penetration tests, do you do footprint and stuff like that as well? Because obviously you mentioned that you purchase the domains that got similar names and stuff. Is that just part of like your red team experience? Or
that is more red teaming, kind of the OSINT kind of open source intelligence testing. We do sometimes do it. It's great if you're doing, for example, web apps that have lots of email addresses. We use tools like the Harvester. It's normally really good. Goes out to the internet. Kind of, you can get a nice long list of usernames, especially for red teaming as well. We can use them in the future. We do standard like information gathering. So who owns your servers? We normally do that before testing. So we normally do who is make sure that your permissions are in place as well, especially if you weren't aware that it was in AWS. But as far as fingerprinting and kind of actual controls, there's no real benefit as a security risk. I do look at sometimes who's registered on the whois information. Normally we recommend that whoever's in that domain, there's an email address that sometimes a lot of people set to their own personal email. We normally do, or sometimes would potentially raise that if it was something of concern that we could then use for username enumeration, but we normally like to see just administrator at, for example. But as far as fingerprinting and that kind of stuff, that's much more of the infrastructure side of things. So in a lot of our reports, we have nice big long network tables at the bottom that says, well, we fingerprinted this server, and that's where you get the OS detection kind of sometimes a bit ambiguous. So we do fingerprint kind of version scans, but we use it mainly for version discovery to get a better understanding of the attacks we could perform. If we know that by fingerprinting a server we're on IIS, we know that if we're going to run a brute force list, we'll run it against an IIS configuration as opposed to Apache or anything different. So we do use that in the discovery stage, especially with web app server headers. So we do try to fingerprint more for the attack kind of vector, not as a security risk itself. It's more of a step in.
Typically with phishing, we've tested it that much that it leaves very little room for error. There has been one case with another one of our consultants. He had tested it, he'd done everything fine. They had to whitelist like the domain and the IP to make sure it didn't go in the junk file. He only whitelisted it for himself and not the company. So everyone received an email to the junk, and obviously it didn't go through. But fortunately, that wasn't something on our side where we took the blame for it. A story I've got from when I travelled out to Algeria was I was doing some segmentation testing as part of it. I was on the guest network, scanned the corporate range, 2 IP addresses come up. The famous saying I always hear is, oh, you shouldn't be able to do that. So these 2 IP addresses came up. It was an FTP server. Oh, you won't be able to log into it, though. You won't be able to connect to it, so I connected to it. Oh, you won't be able to log into it. Had anonymous login enabled. Oh, you won't be able to do anything now. Listed everything on it. And from there, you could essentially pivot to wherever you want on the network. So
Everyone thinks their stuff is secure until we find a problem.
yeah.
The one great story that I kind of heard about another consultant was a social engineering job, where this guy was doing his first job. He was very, very nervous about it. Managed to get through security, get in, and he managed to get into one of the server rooms. What he'd done is when he plugged in, he obviously called his contact back at his own company. Said, look, fantastic, I've got in, first job, nailed it. It's like, great, can you give me the IP address and a domain name? Tells him the domain name and goes, facing the road, which building did you go to, left or right? He goes, went to the left one. You're in the wrong company, get out. And he'd managed to be that nervous that instead of being in the one on the right, he kind of looked at the road and went into the one on the left and had completely compromised them. And I think to this day, they were never told. That was not IT governance. That was told to me on a course about someone else, which I thought was perfect. I know. But yeah, so it happens. We've had some horrific web applications that you find one small problem, and unfortunately what I find is that mostly on the last day of testing you find the most horrific stuff. So we found on the very final day of testing a bank internally that we found SQL injection in their calendar function. So you're obviously there rushing, trying to get as much evidence as you can. So there's been plenty of other war stories, but more than happy to tell you guys after this as well, if you want to pick our brains whatsoever. Yeah. But if there's nothing else, no other questions. Right? Thank you.